Welcome to the Franciscan Spirituality Center in La Crosse, Wisconsin's What is Spirituality podcast. Your host, Steve Spilde, is the Associate Director at the Center. His guests talk about their evolving understanding of God, prayer, healing, and wholeness.
Welcome, everyone. Today, it is my great honor to welcome John Heagle as my guest. I've had the privilege to know John for about 10 years. I first was acquainted to him. He is the presenter for our Spiritual Direction Preparation Program, our weekend entitled Personal Growth and Faith Development. John's had a great influence on me and my own personal growth and faith development, so it's a real privilege for me to join John in conversation today. Thank you.
Oh, it's good to be with you. Very much so. Thank you.
Could you talk about when you first met with the participants in the Spiritual Direction Preparation Program? How long ago that was, what your first experience was?
I couldn't give you the exact time. I think I've been there 4 times now, and that would be every other year. So it'd be about 10 years ago, I think, that we began that process, particularly because the topic was one that I felt so comfortable with.
What is your credentials to talk about that? Where does that come from? I know you as having experience as a priest. I know that you have experience as an instructor, as a therapist. Talk about your background.
I guess I'd like to start briefly with how I would frame my early life. I grew up with 2 main elements of energy. One is a very close farm Catholic family. My parents were survivors of the Great Depression, and they got married in 1934 and began farming together on the same land that they lived on for 65 years, and that's where I grew up. They had 4 boys. I'm the second oldest. There's a lot of boy energy in our house and a lot of physical interaction, a lot of testosterone energy that was there. We were never a perfect family, but a really close family. What I remember in addition to my farm close family is that I was born in the context of the beginning of the Second World War. Obviously, I was too young. I was born in 1938. November of that year, 7 months after I was born, is when this famous Kristallnacht happened in Germany, when the Nazis began to persecute the Jewish people. Obviously too young to remember. I was even too young to remember much of Pearl Harbor. I was about 3 years old. All I remember was that my parents being very upset. Only later did I come to understand that. Was kind of a background setting that I didn't become aware of until my adolescent years. I could remember the blackouts, the rationing of gasoline, of butter, and of sugar. Of course, we made our own butter, so that wasn't a problem with all that. But I just think that was a very important part. I remember also when you turned 6, you started helping officially with the chores in the barn. And also, since Mom only had 4 boys, she taught us how to cook and clean. So we also learned that. We had to get up before going to school and throw out the silage and feed the cows and then go back in and take a bath and catch the school bus. And so there was this kind of sense of uber responsibility. And I know that I was raised as a kind of pleaser, to be, quote, a good boy, and to jump through all the right hoops, not just with my parents, but in school with the sisters and with the whole church part of it, which was also very important. We went to the church every Sunday and prayed every day, and we had all our meals together because we were working in the field or doing the chores together. So it was that kind of setting, I think, that really helped shape me. I think that's a very significant influence anyway. It also, the war part of it got me back into social justice work.
You grew up in northern Wisconsin near Menominee. You became a priest. Can you talk about that journey? At what point that idea entered your mind, kind of the path that led you in that direction?
It's interesting that probably the 2 sources of what I would call spirituality, in those days they didn't speak of it that way, but the 2 sources of mystery, I guess is the word I would use, or of religious presence, were the forest, the farmland, the fields, and we had a creek at the bottom of our land and a river within a quarter of a mile, the Red Cedar River. And so the rivers and the forest and the fields were one real profound source for me of spontaneous nature mysticism. I had a real sense of union with mystery, with the holy. I wouldn't have called that God. God was more in church. And so the second part of it was I became an altar server early. Remember, as soon as you receive your first communion when you're second grade, you could become an altar server, but you had to memorize the Latin. In those days, the Mass was in Latin. For some reason, I was always a quester. I always wanted to know why. And I remember the first response prayers before the altar was, Adeum quilitificat juventutem meum. And it took me a long time in the second grade, obviously, to memorize that. And I went to the sister who was training us, and I said, well, what does that mean? She said, it doesn't matter what it means. It's from one of the Psalms. It's from one of the Psalms. Just pray it. But I was determined to find out what it meant. And when I found out that it was Psalm 42, and it meant, I will go to the altar of God, and I will do so with the joyfulness of youth. I thought, holy mackerel, that's great. So being an altar server, and there was something about church, the Eucharist or the Mass, that really was very sacred, even though it was in another language and the ritual was outdated. I experienced another kind of mystery there that in the fields and forest and the river. Probably going into high school and then especially in college, the question became for me, what's the connection between creation and the holy in religion? Because the message often was, the world is a veil of tears, and it's something that we're here to find the escape route from. And yet I kept saying, well, I don't know what they mean by the world, but the world I know is something that I deeply love, and I find life in it. So I kept trying to resolve this paradox of the world is a suspicious place or a dangerous place, and our purpose is to get to heaven. That was an ongoing struggle for me in college.
So what I'm hearing you say is the struggle was to get to heaven, to get out of this bad place. But you're thinking of the forest back where you grew up and thought, this is not a bad place. I could spend my time here.
Precisely. When in grade school, on the last day of school, we get off the school bus at the corner and take off our shoes, carry them home, and we never put our shoes on until it's time to go back to school again in the fall. Wow. That's how it was. And so I've come to understand now what Jesus means by the world is not creation. He means the world of oppression and political machinations and the power of imperialism. That's what he's talking about. That's the world in the Gospel of John. When the Gospel of John says, God so loved the world, well, that's not the systems of oppression. That's creation. But I didn't know that at the time. And so that was a struggle for me. And I think that the breaking point for me was in 1958. I was sent to Catholic University for my further seminary training. I was studying philosophy at the time, and it was still kind of the old worn-out scholastic philosophy of Thomism, studying St. Thomas in Latin, and I was getting more and more bored with it. And I remember reading someplace his book, The Human Phenomenon, and it was forbidden in seminary libraries. So one Saturday afternoon, I took the bus downtown to Gallery's bookstore, and I purchased a copy of Human Phenomenon. I brought it back under my coat. And that night I told my roommate, I'm going to read this book after grand silence. I was still reading it when the bell went off at 5:30 to get up. And it was a breakthrough because Teilhard basically resolved that issue of there's not the world over here and the holy or the divine over there. They're both together through the process of evolving creation and evolving human beings. And so it was like a light went on for me. It was one and the same time a great relief, because I was saying maybe I'm in the wrong place. I shouldn't even be in the seminary because I don't believe this stuff.
I find that fascinating, that whole mystery of the incarnation, the human and the divine in the same person. The church professes that as a reality, but yet the need to separate the world from the divine,
Isn't that an interesting paradox? Because when I was growing up, we talked about the incarnation, but the emphasis was never on the humanity of Jesus. It was always on the divinity. I can remember having this image from catechism class in grade school of when Jesus was born, because he was divine, that there he was in the manger, and he kind of looked out and said, well, okay, there's going to be some shepherds coming, and a few days there's going to be wise men. And he looked ahead and said, well, I'm going to have 3 days that are going to really be pretty tough. But after that, I'm going to rise. Like he had this whole script unfortunately, whether they intended or not, the church gave us was that Jesus was divine. And he was human, but you didn't see the human part of it. You didn't see the incarnational dimension. At least I didn't, as much as I have come to see that that's precisely what God is doing, is embracing all of creation and all of humanity.
So Teilhard really opened things up for you. The presenter of you that I know, you've just really continued to uncover that. What are the implications of that? That God is present in this world. It's not God is not somewhere else, but if you want to meet God, open your eyes to your life, open your eyes to the creation, open your eyes to the neighbor. Whatever's happening right now, this is God in our midst. Am I tracking with you?
You're saying it very accurately. What I think is central to most emerging Christian religions, and for that matter, most spiritual traditions today, is well, you mentioned this before, it's the movement from individual salvation to much more of a sense of the we, and not the we is not only myself and my fellow humanity and the people I love, my family, my friends, my colleagues, but the we is creation. It's the universe that we're all part of, and to begin to see that as the unfolding kind of unfinished symphony of the holy presence. I mean, I more and more have a difficult time thinking of God as a person. I think God is certainly personal, probably supra-personal would be a way to describe it, but I tend to think of God, or whatever the word is you want to use, the divine or the mystery. I think I use the word the holy presence, because the holy presence is enveloping and inclusive of all, from the smallest electrons and below to the galaxies beyond us. It includes everything. So it's the mystery that's closer to us than our breath and nearer to us than our heartbeat. And to come to realize that then is to see it everywhere.
So you got introduced to that. You were still in school. You had not yet become a priest. You were still in school, right? Correct? You got introduced to that, but my sense is that continued to unfold over the years that would come.
It did. And when I was first introduced to it, it brought about a great sense of relief, sense of vision for me, but it was in conflict with what the church and theology was teaching at the time. The last 4 years of theology was exactly the 4 years of the Second Vatican Council, which blew open that whole separation between heaven and earth, matter and spirit, soul and mind, and then said it is all inclusive. And I had to kind of study the Second Vatican Council documents. A lot of the theology professors, since it was unfolding, they were still giving us the old stuff, except for the biblical people. I had some great biblical scholars, Roland Murphy and others that were terrific. So I had to mainly do the reading at the time. And I would say that probably another very significant turning point for me. I had a great sense of hope and a great sense of energy and enthusiasm. And I have to say, realistically, it lasted for about 10 years. And then I sensed the church, the Catholic Church, my tradition, getting a little bit frightened of where this was all going. And they began to circle the wagons a little bit, emphasize more, we kind of have to back up and not move forward. And I always felt that was a sad thing, because everybody else, or a lot of other dimensions of our culture and thinking and books, were moving forward. So I tried to keep up with that. And that was a very important growth experience for me.
Give me the backdrop of, during the same time, you were involved in parish ministry?
Yes, I was involved in parish ministry at the very beginning and part-time in marriage work. And then I also became the associate chaplain at the Newman Center in La Crosse, and then a campus minister and professor of philosophy at Viterbo for 7 years. Then I was out in a rural parish, and then in an urban parish in Eau Claire for 8 years. And I was also the first director of the Office of Justice and Peace for the Diocese of La Crosse. 1976 was the year of the call to action in Detroit. Catholics were a very significant turning point in terms of ideas related to justice and peace, equality with women, even the possibility of women being ordained, that came out of that Detroit conference. the bishops became very upset and frightened by that and basically tabled it. So the call to action became a separate lay-led organization that I stayed involved with because I thought it was still carrying the vision forward.
Had you gone back to school at some point, or joined the faculty at Viterbo? You'd already had gained that education before you became a parish priest?
I got a master's degree in philosophy at Catholic University, and that was sufficient in those days undergraduate students. I also was sent back to Rome for graduate studies in church law, which was a very significant experience just for me to learn about the church as a system and as a reality. But probably the next great turning point was in 1985, when Archbishop Raymond Hunthausen invited Sister Fran Furter and myself to come out to Seattle, the Archdiocese of Seattle, and begin a counseling center for ministers, for priests, sisters, brothers, and career lay people, and to teach. We're teaching at Seattle University as adjunct instructors. That was a major breakthrough because I had to go back to school again to get licensed as a psychotherapist. In a way, Steve, I would think of it as almost a second call. Becoming a therapist is another whole kind of pastoral endeavor.
The ministry shifts from focusing on a congregation to focusing on an individual or focusing on a couple.
Right. It's a very significant shift. In parish ministry, the interesting thing is that you don't have the kind of professional boundary that you have when you become a therapist. You have rather strict ethical rules about not having dual relationships, whereas in a parish, it was inevitable. So that was a kind of a shift for me to have to learn what that meant. But the significant thing for me was I thought it would be, I don't want to say less pastoral or less spiritual, but it actually became a deepening of spirituality because as someone like yourself and all those who become spiritual directors, you're entering into sacred ground that I knew of as a priest when I would, either when someone was dying or before a baptism, or people would come in when they were in crisis. As a counselor and as a psychotherapist, it's every day. What helped me resolve the tension between caring and not caring is finding a stillness, because it isn't that you stop caring, but it is that you said, I'm not the Messiah, I'm not the Savior. All I can do is listen and be present to the deep mystery. And as a spiritual director, there's nothing more sacred than the inner journey of people's lives.
Let me check if I'm following you. As a therapist, someone could make an appointment with you for an hour session. You could give them your full attention. That was the only agenda on your schedule. Their undivided attention. But then you knew there was a starting point, there was an ending point, and you could still take care of John. Whereas in the parish, that was much harder to do. Am I tracking?
You're naming it correctly. For me, at the beginning, boundaries of a therapist was not something that drew me. It was something that kind of got in the way because I thought I was supposed to be on duty 24 hours a day. It was like I had to make this transition to say, you are not here 24/7. You are here to help people in a more deep, depthful way for a brief amount of time. And it's a respectful way of standing with them in their freedom, respecting that you're not the one who's going to solve this. It was a difficult thing to move from being pastoral caregiver to being a counseling listener. I guess I began to realize that my vocation, when I was a kid growing up, if you were Catholic and you felt the tug toward religion and you were a Catholic boy, you had three choices. You become a monk or a brother or a priest. And, all three of them had the same bottom line. You had to be a celibate. But in those days, I didn't think about the celibacy part. I just thought, well, this is what I know I'm drawn to, and I feel almost like I'm driven toward it, toward whatever this mystery is and whatever I'm supposed to do. And that experience becomes different in a distinct way. It's almost like in pastoral ministry, you're doing evangelization. In therapy, it feels sometimes like I'm doing pre-evangelism. You're just listening. It doesn't matter what their religious specific doctrinal issues are. It's what is the painful wounds of their life and where can they find hope, which is even more profound.
If someone is in a situation where they're being beaten or abused, you can talk about being salvation, all that sort of thing, but I don't need salvation 40 years from now. I'm being beaten and abused. I need salvation from this particular pain right here, right now.
Exactly. So many people who have been abused are literally, as you know, suffering from post-traumatic stress. And so you need to begin to help them find what are the triggers that bring about flashbacks and memory explosions. What are the triggers, and what do you begin to do immediately to say that was then and this is now? It really comes down to how do they begin to develop a radical trust in life, which for me is another description of faith.
Radical trust in life. I love that phrase. You've given me your evolving definition of faith. Give me a few more definitions. What is your evolving definition of religion and your evolving definition of spirituality? Are those two the same? Or are those two distinct?
When I was growing up, religion and spirituality were the same, basically because the word spirituality was very seldom used. What was used was spirit, and spirit had to do with something that's not flesh. It had to do with mind over matter, that dualistic split. My experience was that religion, and it still is my conviction, religion should be the primary bearer of spirituality. And if you look at the world traditions, the spiritual traditions that emerged in what's called the first axial period from about 800 BCE to 200 BCE, when most of the world religions emerged, religion was reformed by spiritual insight from cultic and magic and a sense of fate and trying to please, quote, the gods above us with sacrifice of various kinds, to an inner sense of meaning and relationship with whatever this ultimate mystery happens to be. There was a time, and I think ideally, religion should, as I say, be the bearer of spirituality, but when religion gets more focused on doctrine or rules and loses its touch with human experience, then spirituality will revolt. It'll resist and say, well, I'm sorry, but you're not feeding me. You're not talking to me. People will begin to seek to be fed where they can find food, where they can find meaning, where they can find significance. And I think one of the ways in which religion right now, as I think is an incredible time of crisis, is that it has lost touch with some of its deep roots, its founding vision and sense of passion, and it needs to readjust to, what I would believe is an evolutionary process-oriented view of the holy. The new creation story has to become part of preaching and catechesis, not something that, you can look at that if you'd like to, but it should be more mainstream. That would be the first thing I'd say. The second is that for me, spirituality itself has evolved. I would say that initially spirituality still had a little bit of the leftover of emphasis on heaven and the afterlife and beyond, whereas over the last 40 years, it's become much more inclusive and integrated into a holistic perspective. At least that's what on my good days, I like to describe it that way. So I would describe spirituality as the core vision and ethical life values out of which you live your life. But I think everybody has a spirituality. Most of my clients in the last 25 years have not been Catholic, have not even been particularly belonging to any religious, or they were one time belonged to church and left. He would come in and ask me more for answers, and I would always kind of push it back on him. Well, one day he brought in the Oregonian newspaper that had the headlines on it from the Pew Report that said 30% of young adults that are growing up today have left the religion of their parents and of their ancestors. So he threw the paper down on my desk and said, "Father, what are you going to do about that?" and I said, "Well, Frank, what is it you think I should do?" He said, "Well, you're a priest, you should fix it." And I said, "Well, Frank, let me ask you something." I said, "Tell me why you go to church every Sunday." And he didn't break a moment. He said, "Well, that's easy. I go to church every Sunday to punch my stay out of hell card for one more week." And I remember looking at him and smiling and saying, "You know what, Frank? That's why a lot of people are no longer going to church. Fear doesn't work for them. They're looking for something that motivates them, that gives them meaning." And so what I've come to describe spirituality personally for me is what drives me. what is my passion in terms of my spiritual vision and my pastoral action, not just what I believe in. I think there's a danger sometimes that we leave spirituality with some kind of an interior reflective sense rather than seeing that contemplation always has to come over into action. And so one of my favorite passages is Mark chapter 1, verse 12, where it says, the Spirit drove Jesus into the desert. And the word there, expale, it's like Jesus was thrown into the desert by the Spirit. And it's like, what takes possession of you in a good way, in a creative, passionate way? That's, for me, is what my spirituality is.
Circling back to when you were young, you did have this sense of connecting with the Holy Mystery. You know, like you're talking about being in the woods and by the stream. Right. On the land, barefoot. There was something there. There was something special. There was something that made your heart feel more alive. I love that story with learning how to be an altar server and the prayer. It's like, but what does the prayer mean? It's like, don't worry about what it means. Just say it. And so what I hear you saying is sometimes religion can be a thing of don't worry about what it means, just say it. And you're saying even from an early age, it's like, no, I know what it feels like when it means something, and I have to connect with that part of me that's meaningful. Am I tracking with you?
You would make a great spiritual director for me, Steve. I mean that seriously, as well as in deep friendship, because you really have the gift of hearing deeply and mirroring. That says it, because the passion, the spiritual passion I had as a child was a sense of wonder at the beauty and power of creation. I mean, I took 4-H, so I took forestry for 2 years, and I could identify all of the various species of trees, and I planted 150 Norway spruce on our own property in addition to the forest there. That's where I experienced, it wasn't so much I had to assent to a doctrine of God. I experienced. That's, I think, what kept me going, because now I can say that it is less that I have to make an intellectual assent to, let's say, the creeds. I mean, I believe in the creeds. I don't understand them. I can say I experience the presence of God.
Before I let you go, you tell this beautiful story when you come to do the SDPP weekends, the story of accompanying the woman who was dying. You know the story I'm talking about?
I do.
That just covers so much of this. Like she needed a connection with God that was real. It couldn't be hypothetical. It couldn't be just say it. She had to use words that were true.
She's a woman who, well, actually, she's still living, even though she was told that she was going to die. She had a rare form of cancer, and her doctor gave her 6 weeks to live. And she's an attorney, family, originally from Hawaii. And she came to see me one day. I'd never met her before. I had an appointment with her, and she showed up and said, "I'm here for one reason. I want you to help me learn how to die." And I said, "Can you tell me more about that?" And she said, "The doctor says I have about 6 months to live at the outside." And she said, I'm afraid to die. I don't know what that means. And I said, "Well, I don't know if I can teach you how to die, but I'll walk with you and we can listen to what that mystery is." So we met about 3 or 4 times. And the 5th time she came in and she said, "I really appreciate our times together and our conversations. But," she said, "last night I had a dream that has really riveted me." And she said, in the dream, I was in a large auditorium, like conference auditorium. And I was alone in there except for one other person who was clear on the other side of the room. And she said, I couldn't see that person, but I knew it was Jesus. And I said, "Jesus, I can't hear you. Come closer." And she said, all at once he was sitting right next to me. And he looked at me and he said, "Everything is going to be all right." And I remember there was a pause, and I said, "Well, what do you think he meant by that?" And she said, "Whether I live or whether I die, everything is going to be all right." And I remember looking at her and smiling and saying, "Esther, you don't need me to teach you how to die. You're teaching me something about the whole mystery of living." as well as die.
If you have any questions about any of the programs that they offer at the Franciscan Spirituality Center in La Crosse, Wisconsin, we invite you to call us at 608-791-5295. That's 608-791-5295. You can also visit our website at www.fscenter.org. www.fscenter.org. Thank you for listening.